The survival horror subgenre of video games has been a pretty successful category for a long time now. The focus on de-emphasizing combat, claustrophobic level design, inventory management, and solving puzzles to unlock shortcuts was, and still is to this day, an incredibly satisfying way to experience a story with some fear factor. Sure, a game can throw big monsters your way and expect you to kill them, or rely on jump scares to convey the atmosphere, but it's these identifiable traits of the survival horror genre that, at least in my opinion, make for the most terrifying and entertaining gameplay experiences. Your objective isn't to run away from something and get from A to B, or use your massive gun to kill the thing before it kills you. You have to escape the scenario you find yourself in by pacing yourself and conserving useful items until they become absolutely necessary. Now, a lot of games get the credit for inventing this type of gameplay loop, from Atari 2600 titles like Haunted House, to the NES classic Sweet Home, to Alone in the Dark, released in 1992 on PC. But most people tend to agree that the game that pioneered the genre, and at least launched it into mainstream success, is 1996's Resident Evil for the Sony PlayStation. Often overlooked these days due to the infamous cheesy dialogue or the series' more recent and polished entries, the first game in this series does still hold up as a tense experience with some incredibly engaging gameplay mechanics. Now, in this video I won't really be talking about in-depth story details or anything, but I will be talking about certain scenarios and enemies that show up in the latter half of the game, so if you want to avoid any of that kind of stuff, then this is your spoiler warning. Now, without any further ado, let's talk about Resident Evil. It seems that when you hear anybody talk about the original PlayStation 1 version of Resident Evil, it's usually for its poorly acted live-action opening sequence, or its comically bad voice performances. I'm pretty sure the nature of these performances didn't come from any intentional tonal decision, but rather from it being a relatively low-budget game created by a Japanese studio that didn't exactly have access to some of America's best and brightest young actors. I suppose that when you're in a country that's 97.9% Japanese and you don't have a lot of money to throw people's way, beggars can't really be choosers. So where people often go wrong when discussing this aspect of the game is that Capcom did not make a cheesy game on purpose, but where they're very much right is that the subpar quality of the performances does add to the campy B-movie nature of the narrative. Don't get me wrong, I do still think that the game holds up and can be quite spooky in places, but it comes more from being thrown into a situation that you don't know how to handle yet, as opposed to being in an inherently creepy environment. This game is not scary to look at or to be in the presence of, but when a giant freaking spider starts scuttling your way, it does set you a little on edge. But whenever a cutscene triggers and you have to sit through lines like these,
"Stop it! Don't open that door!"
it kind of removes you from the scenario a little bit, like you're watching a shitty horror movie from the 80s where everybody is inexperienced and just overacts. I don't really see this as a bad thing, it just accomplishes something different than it was likely going for. You can happily play through Resident Evil and enjoy it for what it is, but I think it ultimately failed in creating the atmosphere that the developers wanted. Enter Resident Evil Remake, released in 2002 for the Nintendo GameCube. A from-the-ground-up reinterpretation of the original game's core story, characters, locations, and mechanics, but aimed to bring the experience up to date for the new console generation. Improved visuals, additional story details, and new features made for a game that retained the original's ambition, but elevated the atmosphere to something more in line with what they were initially going for. It's actually quite incredible how the time span between these games is only 6 years. That would be the equivalent of remaking Resident Evil 7 today, and I seriously doubt that the difference in visual fidelity would be as noticeable as this one. So the initial setup is that the Alpha team of a squad called STARS, that's Special Tactics and Rescue Service, are sent into the Arklay Mountains where their Bravo team recently disappeared after being sent themselves to investigate reports of monsters roaming around the area. The team, consisting of Albert Wesker, Barry Burton, Joseph Frost, Brad Vickers, Chris Redfield, and Jill Valentine, discover the remains of Bravo Team's downed helicopter, and soon after, Joseph is killed by a pack of infected dogs, so Brad retreats in fear and flies the helicopter away, leaving the rest of the team behind. Albert, Barry, Chris, and Jill manage to escape the nearby threat by retreating into a nearby mansion hidden in the mountains, and this is where most of the game takes place. You have to explore the mansion by finding keys to rooms which contain other keys to different rooms and so on, whilst defending yourself from the infected hostiles hiding away within the walls. It's a straightforward setup, but slowly drip feeds more lore details to you as the narrative unfolds. And to be honest, at least in this first game, the story isn't really the point. It's about balancing that gameplay loop which consists mostly of trade-offs. So every choice that you make in Resident Evil will likely be a trade-off of some kind. Before you even begin the game proper, you'll have a choice of which character you'd like to play as, Chris or Jill. Now, most people tend to describe choosing Chris as the hard mode and Jill as the easy mode, and I can understand why, but it's not actually that cut and dry. There are pros and cons for each of them. If you choose to play as Chris, you'll find yourself with 6 item slots instead of the 8 that Jill finds herself with, and you'll have to find small keys for certain drawers and cabinets which take up an item slot, where Jill can use her lockpick, which doesn't. But the game tries to balance this by giving Chris a larger health pool and faster movement speed. Most feel that these differences don't exactly balance out equally, especially because Jill also gets a grenade launcher later, so in the remake they gave Chris a few more perks. He now handles weapons better than Jill, which allows him to aim quicker and land more critical hits. He has flash grenades which are capable of decapitating zombies, which is useful for a reason that I'll get into later, and now permanently has the lighter in an additional slot like Jill's lockpick, so when you're needing to light a fire, you only need 1 item slot available for the kerosene instead of the 2 that Jill would need because she doesn't have the lighter full time. I also feel like Chris's playthrough reveals more of the story that will come into play in the sequels, so if you're wanting to experience that side of the series, then maybe you're going to have a tougher playthrough ahead of you. As I said, it's all about trade-offs. The inventory system is fundamental to the success of the survival horror gameplay loop. That's one of the reasons I didn't find my playthrough of Resident Evil Village that scary. I don't think I once ever had to free up an item slot for something because I had so many of them. In RE1, everything becomes a burden, so you have to make a choice. If I take all of this ammo for my gun, then I may not have enough space to pick up a key that I need. But in turn, if I go out without enough firepower, I might become overwhelmed by zombies. The handgun is obviously weaker than the shotgun, but since a clip carries 15 rounds where the shotgun only loads 6 shells, you can take that weapon without using an extra slot for ammo and technically have more shots available. The game forces you to think in these ways and strategize before you head out into the fray. To save your game, you have to use an ink ribbon at a typewriter, which are very few and far between. The ink ribbons are finite, meaning that you only have a limited number of saves that you can use in a playthrough, and on top of that, they also take up an item slot. It's not uncommon for you to find yourself in a situation where you're on very low health and come across an ink ribbon with 1 item slot available. Do you take it and hope that there's a typewriter nearby so that you can save your game? Or leave that slot free in case you come across a green herb and you can heal yourself? This kind of brings me to a nitpick I have where you can't swap items over, so if your inventory is full and you come across a herb you want to pick up, you can't just swap it out for one of the clips you're holding or something. You have to go back to an item box and offload what you don't want. It's a tad annoying, but I can also see how this adds to that element of planning and trade-offs that I mentioned before. The remake made some improvements to this, like now you can use a green herb even if you're at full health just to get rid of it, but you still can't swap items out, so it obviously was an intentional choice on the developer's behalf. But I do find it interesting how the character you play as has an impact on the way you explore the environment. I found that as Jill, I interacted with everything in the area and picked up key items all the time, which wouldn't be useful until much later. But it wasn't a problem because once I attained 3 or so of them, I'd pop them in the item box and carry on. With Chris, however, I wasn't willing to sacrifice my ammo or healing items to do that, so I often left things behind and made a mental note to come back for it later when I needed it for a puzzle. It's not just the inventory space though, because a lot of the tension comes from how unintuitive combat feels in this game. People seem to get a lot of joy out of shitting on the game's tank controls, but I think it's kind of essential to the experience. For those who don't know, tank controls basically move your character from a perspective relative to them instead of the camera. So if you're walking down a corridor and the camera is placed in front of Jill, pushing forwards on the controller won't move her further away from you, but instead forwards in relation to where she's facing. Up is forwards, down is backwards, and left and right rotates the direction you're facing. It sounds awkward when I explain it like that, but 1, you get used to it really quickly, and 2, it was kind of necessary when this came out. While Resident Evil was being developed, the DualShock controller hadn't come out yet, so there was no analog sticks, just directional buttons. But like I said, this control scheme does a lot for the tension building because it's easy enough to adapt to in order to navigate the areas, but not quite natural enough to make you feel like you can run circles around enemies. That's one of the reasons I can't see this game working in the same format as the RE2, RE3, and RE4 remakes. Navigating the Spencer Mansion with the third-person over-the-shoulder camera and modern controls just would be too comfortable to accurately reflect the true RE1 experience. An example of this is in the HD remaster of the remake for PC, PS4, and Xbox One. There's an alternate control scheme where the tank controls are removed and movement is updated to feel more modern. I can admit that it is more intuitive to control, but it does compromise the vibe a little. Like I mentioned, it diminishes a lot of the game's fear factor because you now feel like you can duck and weave in between enemies. On top of that, it doesn't blend with the static camera angles well at all because when you're pushing one way on the analog stick and then the camera switches, your character will quickly 180 and go back the way they came. This never happened before because pushing the up button would always move them forward relative to the way they were facing, but altering it to be relative to the camera doesn't really work when the camera is all over the place. In the later remakes, you control the camera yourself, you're completely in control. But now imagine that your control scheme was inverted for a split second a few times every minute. That gets quite frustrating to control, and to be honest, there are times when it's helpful to be using the old scheme. In the courtyard, there are a few crows that are passive when you walk by, but get aggroed if you run. With the new control scheme, you're set to be running by default, and you have to slowly push the stick slightly to walk, which means that you'll likely get attacked by the crows pretty much every time you encounter them. Yeah, you can just walk past them if you know that, but if you're playing with this control scheme by default, I wouldn't blame you for just thinking that these enemies are broken. Sometimes you can't see if an enemy is around the corner because of the camera angle, but if you walk backwards, your character will pull their shoulders back to avoid getting swiped if something is there. This is an incredibly helpful way of gauging your surroundings without walking closer to the potential threat to trigger a camera change. But you can't walk backward with the modern controls because you'll just 180 on the spot. It's actually quite fitting since we were talking about trade-offs earlier. Maybe you think the more natural control setup is worth these drawbacks, but my advice would be to play with the classic scheme. Now, what I think is likely Resident Evil's most identifiable trait is the general disincentive to enter combat at all. Despite my praise for the tank controls, I can't quite say the same about firing your guns. You hold down the shoulder button to raise your firearm and press the action button to fire. You can hold up or down while aiming to point your weapon in either direction, but neither are truly useful unless an enemy is mere feet in front of you. Aiming up can be good for decapitating zombies, and aiming down can be great for taking out nearby dogs, but if they're more than a few feet away, you're gonna be going for torso shots, and frankly, enemies can take a while to go down. Especially in the early game, when you don't have much ammo to play with, you might not want to waste your precious resources taking down every enemy you come across. Maybe you want to save those magnum rounds or those acid shells for an upcoming boss. So this is where you have to start making a choice about who you want to spend your ammo on taking out. Ideally, you want the areas surrounding your safe rooms to be clear, but do you want to kill these spiders in this hallway when you can just run past them before they have a chance to get you? It might not be worth it. Most games have you asking, how am I going to kill this thing? Where most of your time here will be spent asking, what am I going to kill? You might want to head somewhere else in the mansion and think, I can take the faster route, but I'll have to spend more ammo to kill whatever might be in the way. So you'll intentionally take a longer route, but one that will save you ammo in the long run. And this whole thing comes together full circle in the remake with the addition of the Crimson Heads. Now, you'll begin to notice that after killing a zombie and leaving the room, the corpse will still be there when you come back. You might just think this is a nice little detail of the newer and more powerful hardware to keep the tension, but these dead bodies are essentially ticking time bombs. Once a certain amount of time passes, a dead zombie will come back as a Crimson Head, which is a much quicker and deadlier stage of the mutation. The only way to prevent a zombie turning into a Crimson Head is to remove the head, incinerate the body, or don't kill it in the first place. This is why Chris's flash grenades I mentioned earlier are useful. When you put a zombie down, you can use kerosene and a lighter to burn and destroy the body, but like I said, this will take another item slot for Chris, and another 2 for Jill, so now you have to take that into account when planning your loadout. You want to leave room in your inventory for any keys you come across, but you're sacrificing the ability to incinerate the zombies you kill. Alternatively, you might decide to leave a zombie alive because you don't have any kerosene to hand and don't want to deal with a Crimson Head later. The game's difficulty comes less from challenging combat and more from challenging decisions. Now, something that every horror game has in common is that they get less scary as time goes on. From the latter half of a game where you fully understand the mechanics now and know how to abuse the enemy's AI, to your 5th playthrough where you remember all the item locations and combat encounters. But what Resident Evil succeeds at is pulling the rug from underneath you just as you start to get comfortable. We've already discussed how the tank controls, limited inventory, and static camera angles work together to make the player overly cautious in their decision making, but half of the game's feeling of dread comes from the environments. When you start playing Resident Evil for the first time, I reckon a few hours will pass before you start to feel truly comfortable in your environment. This is roughly how long it'll take on a first playthrough to get familiar with the layout of the mansion and remember where the enemies that you haven't killed still are. You'll get to the point where you know how to maneuver around the odd straggler you've left alone or go a different route to avoid them altogether. But after you complete the guardhouse or residence section, the enemy placements in the mansion will begin to differ. The L-shaped corridor with the infamous Cerberus jump scare now houses 2 hairy-ass spiders that are hanging around the ceiling. Hallways that used to contain a zombie or 2 now house hunters, which are incredibly dangerous due to their speed and raw damage output. The game waits for you to get comfortable and then snatches it away from you. The Director's Cut, which was a re-release of the original game in 1997, featured an arrange mode, which moved about item locations to switch up the initial flow of progression. This was designed to take back players that were so familiar with the game that they could do knife-only playthroughs and no damage runs. The remake takes this a step further by not only moving items around, but even altering the solutions to some puzzles altogether. In the original game, you had to solve this riddle consisting of different portraits lined up in a hall. The solution was to press the buttons underneath them in the order of a person's life cycle, starting with the baby and ending with the old man. The remake features the same idea, with portraits and buttons underneath them, but the riddle is different. Now you have to experiment with the lights and make the specific items glow the same colour as the portrait at the end of the corridor. I wouldn't say that this new puzzle is any easier or harder than the original, but the mere fact that it was a different clue stops you from entering the correct combination from muscle memory alone. This is an incredible idea because you essentially get to play a game that you love for the first time again. You might remember that in the PS1 version you had to push this ladder to reach the top of the statue and retrieve the map, but in the remake, the ladder is missing. You'll likely look around for it thinking that it was moved somewhere else, but no, you have to move the unit away from the opening as usual, and now push that towards the statue and mantle onto it. It forces you to think creatively and come up with more lateral ideas to overcome your obstacles. As well as changing the puzzles, the remake actually alters the setting of the mansion as well. Not just as in a fresh coat of paint on the beautiful 2D pre-rendered backgrounds, but by adding new rooms and corridors that weren't in the original. After finding Kenneth's body at the start of the game, you'd normally have to turn back the way you came since the corner was a dead end. But now, there's another door here. It doesn't lead to a little storeroom or something, but extends down a long hallway, up a flight of stairs, and connects to other areas. Because you now have alternate ways of getting somewhere, the doors that you're used to progressing through might now be locked until later, and you have to rethink your approach. Some of the scares are different. We already talked about the Crimson Heads, but the thing manages to use your pre-existing knowledge against you. The Cerberus jump scare used to trigger when you walked through the L-shaped corridor for the first time, but now the glass just slightly cracks a little. It's not until you come back and return through the corridor in the opposite direction that they break through. You spend the whole game anticipating encounters that you've grown accustomed to, but the remake refuses to let you off that easily. At the beginning, you have to search the entire entrance hall for Wesker when he goes missing, but in the remake, there's now a steel gate at the back of the room. Upon investigating it, you can hear tortured moaning coming from the other side. We later discover that this is the voice of Lisa Trevor, a character that was cut from the PS1 version before release. She ends up becoming an immovable force that stalks you throughout the game and is invincible to any damage that you can do to her. She's pretty terrifying, but this small moment where you don't even see her is incredibly impactful because you have absolutely no idea what could be making that sound. Again, she wasn't in the original, so there is nothing to prepare you for it. It builds a sense of dread by refusing the player any sense of familiarity. And I think that's kind of what makes Resident Evil one of the most replayable games of all time. The gameplay loop is satisfying enough to be able to do that anyway, but the fact that you can experience the events of the Spencer Mansion in so many different ways does a lot for drawing you back in for more than one playthrough. You finish the game as Chris, and then you can play as Jill, where you miss certain story events but experience other ones in its place. Maybe last time you didn't get the serum fast enough and Richard died from the venom in his blood, but this time you managed to save him. After that playthrough, you play again as Chris in Arrange mode, where all the key items have moved, which shuffles the entire progression up. Then you do Arrange mode again as Jill. Maybe you play through Deadly Silence, the game's DS port, which adds some extra gimmicky bits and pieces. Then you play through the remake and have to relearn the mansion's layout and new order of events. Then you do it again as the opposite character. There are so many different ways to experience this game, and there aren't many others that allow you to have that first playthrough like 7 different times. If you're tempted at all to play Resident Evil for the first time and don't know where to start, then I would suggest the remake. It virtually improves everything about the original, the only caveat being the absence of cheesy voice lines.
This house is dangerous. There are terrible demons.
The PS1 version is great for a naff bit of campy fun, but the remake is the true RE experience and the one that I recommend you start with. Unless you want to start at the beginning so that you can experience the changes for the first time like players did back in 2002. I'll leave that up to you, but honestly, I don't think you can really go wrong either way.